PLA to finally establish an overseas military base on the Coco Islands as well, nearby to Malacca on the Strait's western side. As such, Chinese and Russian military vehicles and planes have been frequently spotted in the service of the Tatmadaw military in its complicated war against the many rebel factions now pushing back against it. And Beijing needs the Tatmadaw military to win the civil war in the country, because they need to continue maintaining their ability to keep importing oil and gas through the Sino-Myanmar pipelines in order to keep reducing their over-reliance on energy imports coming through the Malacca Strait, in order to be in a better position to eventually launch their invasion of Taiwan. If the Tatmadaw falls and a new regime unfriendly to Beijing emerges from the chaotic civil war in its place, they could choose to shut the Sino-Myanmar pipelines down when under pressure coming from the United States. And thus, the eventual outcome of the ongoing civil war in Myanmar has direct implications on China's ability to eventually seize Taiwan, and America's ability to counter that invasion. But of course, the Myanmar civil war itself is a very, very complicated and dark subject. It has resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of people in the country only since it began in 2021, and has become one of the 21st century's bloodiest conflicts. But just before it began, between 2016 and 2019, the Tatmadaw military regime, who now mostly rules the country, even further perpetrated one of the 21st century's largest scale genocides against the Rohingya people in Myanmar's western Rakhine state, which resulted in unbelievable levels of human suffering rarely seen since the 20th century, and the largest refugee crisis seen anywhere in Asia since the Vietnam War. The complicated and massive internal conflict still raging across Myanmar is thus one of the darkest chapters of all of 21st century history so far, and it is directly related to everything that you just listened to me talk about throughout this entire video. But unfortunately, due to the inherently violent, controversial, and recent nature of discussing one of the biggest ongoing genocides and wars taking place anywhere in the world, if I made a video covering it all here on YouTube, it would almost certainly become demonetized and age restricted, which would ultimately mean that YouTube's algorithm would never promote it to you, and you would probably never even see it. That's why instead of uploading it here to YouTube, I created yet another full-length companion video to this one in my ongoing Modern Conflict series that's about the same length as this video you just watched, that covers the entire history, course, and explanation of the ongoing civil war in Myanmar and the associated genocide of the Rohingya people, and uploaded it directly to Nebula. And this is just one of more than 24 exclusive, full-length real-life lore documentaries that you can only find on Nebula in my overall Modern Conflict series there, that can all only be found over there because of all of their darker, more controversial subject material. There are further episodes in Modern Conflict you can go and watch right now as well, covering China's own genocidal actions against the Uyghur people in the Xinjiang province, other recent major civil wars like the ones in Ethiopia, Syria, Libya, and Yemen, episodes covering how ISIS was able to rapidly rise to power in the Middle East and then was subsequently defeated, more episodes covering the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine, and dozens of others with brand new episodes releasing over there every single month that will help you keep up to date and informed with why major conflicts in our world are happening. And what's even more, signing up to Nebula will also get you access to all of the other amazing exclusive content from all of the other creators on the platform as well. Because the best part about this site is that it's jointly co-owned by all.
Was pretty good.
On August 28th, 2022.
Thank you. That previous guy already thanked him, but thank you, Johnny Harris. I've liked and subbed to your channel. Here's why everyone's mad about China's new map.
The Chinese government released a map. The map did a surprisingly good job at making a lot of other countries angry.
Several countries have rejected China's new standard map.
It's a violation of the law. So that's where I put that map.
The release of this map also was met with a huge event and announcement within China. This featured the state media launching into a commentary on the importance of maps,
地图是国家版图最主要的表现形式。
followed by a warning to the people that maps that have errors can cause, quote, great harm to society.
危害了我们祖国的这个统一。
So let's look at what's going on with this map, why countries around the region are condemning it, and why China had to go to such great lengths to tell people that there's nothing wrong with these maps, and that in fact, a map like this is key to national unity. To do this, I'm going to need a high-res version of this map. Luckily, the Chinese government has me covered.
地图是国家版图最主要的表现形式。
发布了矢量地图，更好地满足专业用户。
I want to show you what this map says, and show you how China uses cartography to assert and project power in its region. Because as clean as this map looks, within it, there's actually a lot going on. Border tug-of-wars, fake islands, a 10th dash on a line in the ocean, barbed wire wrapped clubs, and proxy wars. It's the perfect example of how maps aren't just maps. They're tools of national power. I don't like the feeling of being spied on. And like all of us, I am spied on all of the time. Not just by governments, but by corporations, by people who want to make money off of my information. That brings me to this quick pause in our video to talk about our sponsor, Incogni. Incogni is a personal information removal service. I don't like the feeling of being spied on. I don't think any of us do, but we all are kind of spied on, some of us by governments, but almost all of us are spied on by corporations who collect our information, put it on these data broker lists, and sell it on an open market to people who want to make money off of us. Luckily, in many countries, including the United States, we have laws and rights to remove ourselves from these lists, but most of us don't know how to do it. It's a cumbersome bureaucratic process. And that brings me to the sponsor of today's video, Incogni, which is a personal information removal service. I've been using Incogni now for a few months, and it has changed my world. What you do is you sign up for Incogni, and you give them permission, and then they go through the process of requesting that you be taken off that list. And if anyone pushes back, like one of the corporations makes it harder, Incogni follows through with the process to make sure that you get off of all of these lists. And then they update you month after month so that you can see the progress. You can see your privacy being reclaimed. The people who want this information aren't just marketers who want to sell you new tennis shoes, but it's like people search sites, which are becoming a thing, that use this data to put you on these people search sites so people can find your information. Health insurance companies will sometimes buy some of this data so that they can use your web browsing history to jack up your health insurance bill. And perhaps most annoyingly, it's spam. I mean, my phone was constantly exploding with random robocalls. I got all these phishing scams all of the time. My information was everywhere and it was blowing up my phone and my inbox. I mean, there's no end to the shenanigans that corporations will do to make money off of you and your information. No longer. Luckily, Incogni exists, and I am genuinely grateful for that. Unrelated to the fact that they're sponsoring today's video, which I'm very grateful for that too. I'm just grateful that they exist because I don't like my information just being everywhere. So if you want to get in on Incogni at a discount, there's a link in my description. It's incogni.com/JohnnyHarris. When you click the link, it helps support the channel and it gets you 60% off their annual plan. The reason I have the annual plan is because even if you get taken off these lists, you'll eventually make it back on. And having Incogni there to constantly monitor these lists and keep getting me off of them is of value to me. So the link's in the description. Use the code Johnny Harris. Thank you, Incogni, for sponsoring our journalism. And now it's time to dive into this mapping story about China and its very, very interesting new map. The government of China wants their country to look like this. But in reality, it looks a lot more like this. We're going to move left to right, from India to Taiwan in the South China Sea. Oh, by the way, the Chinese government requires its map makers to use this algorithm that intentionally scrambles the latitude and longitude coordinates of their maps, all in the name of national security. This makes it hard for people like me to work with Chinese maps. But we were able to hack through these maps and line them up with our own mapping systems, which is how we're able to make this video. Okay, with that, let's get started. First, we have Kashmir, a region that is already heavily disputed between India and Pakistan. The map shows that all of this section is a part of China, and indeed, China controls it. But India claims that this actually belongs to them. It's the source of tense conflict. Both countries are building stuff in this region. Roads, communication towers, airfields, everything to be ready in case a full-blown conflict breaks out. Troops from both sides face each other in a standoff at this line. The line of actual control. That's really what it's called. It loosely marks the border between these two massive countries, a border that was never really agreed upon. Because remember where we are here. We're in the Himalayas, the tallest mountains on Earth. Drawing lines and controlling territory here just doesn't work super well. But both sides want to exert control, even here in the high mountains, especially in these important trade regions. These are two nuclear countries, and so they've agreed to not use firearms up here, no guns. So instead, when conflict breaks out, it looks more like a medieval battle, with barbed wire wrapped clubs and fence posts. The most recent clash was just in 2020, right here near Ladakh. 20 Indian soldiers and 4 Chinese soldiers were killed.
Indian and Chinese soldiers fought on disputed land using stones and bamboo poles, and around 24 people died.
As you go down the border between India and China, there are several more of these pockets of disputed land in the Himalayas. As we head east, we'll hit Nepal, and I have to mention that there was recently a leaked government report out of Nepal that asserts that China is encroaching into Nepal's sovereign territory, building stuff with no permission on Nepal's side of the border here in the Humla district. Nepal actually didn't want this report to come out. They have to walk a fine line being sandwiched between these two behemoth countries, and a big part of that means staying on China's good side. A few years ago, I was up here shooting an episode of Vox Borders, and the locals told me that the Chinese military didn't respect the border. They kind of did whatever they wanted, which is why I wasn't even allowed to get up to the border fence between these two countries. It's an eerie feeling, being so close to a country that is so serious about projecting its power to its neighbors. Anyway, let's keep going east, where we'll hit another landlocked country in the Himalayas, Bhutan. The border here continues to make an effort to divide these countries in a rugged, glacier-filled expanse. Back in 2006, China quietly pressured Bhutan to give them this big chunk of mountain territory, and Bhutan conceded. They didn't really have a choice. And so while they kind of keep it hush-hush, China is reminding the world that they actually control this part of Bhutan. It's theirs now. China's using the same playbook in different parts of Bhutan, blurring this northern border as they encroach south. In 2020, China claimed that they actually own this part of Bhutan, a forested nature sanctuary. But strangely, this official map doesn't show that this area is inside of China's borders. Maybe it will next year. The most strategically important part of China's claim on Bhutan is here. This little strip of land gives us a better idea of why China is squeezing the border of this tiny country. If you zoom out, you'll see where we are. Right here at this vital choke point between these two rivals, India and China. This thin corridor where India connects to its eastern states. Some call this the chicken neck. The map asserts that China owns this part of Bhutan, the Doklam Plateau, which provides them a perfect military vantage point over the chicken neck, India's critical corridor. This would make India vulnerable in the case of an active conflict. Oh, and their claim is not just on the map. Satellite imagery analyzed by Reuters shows that China is building roads and settlements and structures on this sovereign territory of Bhutan, enhancing their strategic military position and fortifying their claim on the map. These border shenanigans in Bhutan are considered a proxy for tension between China and India. Bhutan, like Nepal, is just sandwiched in the middle.
Satellite images of the Chinese incursions in Bhutan, where China has built roads and barracks on the undisputed territory of Bhutan.
Okay, let's keep moving on. Next to Bhutan, China's map shows that all of this land are within its borders. They now call it South Tibet. But all of this territory belongs to India. It's full of Indian citizens. India's claim to this land relies on this 890-kilometer borderline that a British representative drew in 1913 in partnership with a representative from Tibet who agreed to the line. But China says this isn't legitimate. They own Tibet now, and they never authorized this line dividing Tibet from India. So on their map, they assert that all of this belongs to China. And to take it a step further, they're actually renaming stuff on their maps in this region, from mountain peaks to rivers and cities, showing us how China wants to claim and standardize every corner of its country, exerting control and influence even in these remote places. Now, India is not standing by and letting this happen. To counter this, the Indian government is spending $500 million to build roads and develop hundreds of villages with the goal of solidifying their claim to this land. As we head east, let me mention that during the pandemic, China has been building a fence along this border with Myanmar, mostly to keep people and illicit goods out of China. This border has always been porous. People who share culture and language would cross back and forth, informally trading, but this fence has totally changed that, and people are angry. I've considered doing an entire video on this border fence and how it's disturbing and affecting life here. If that's interesting to you, please let me know in the comments. So while this isn't a disputed territory, it is another example of China's increased effort to tighten its control on every corner of its land. Okay, now we've arrived to the ocean, the part of the map that gets a little wild. The government map actually makes it look simple. All of the water inside of this dashed line is China's, but the reality actually looks like this. This is what's known as the 9-dash line, and it was effectively a hand-drawn boundary by the Chinese government in the 1940s. It's not a precise border, it wasn't agreed upon by the countries here, and nor is it legal, at least according to the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, who calls the 9-dash line lawless, because it clearly cuts through the waters that international law says belong to these neighboring countries, and that's how you get this jumble of all these lines. But, as superpowers do, China ignores all of this because they can. And they continue to operate as if this entire ocean, which by the way is replete with fish and fossil fuels, as well as militarily strategic islands and important trade routes, all of it is theirs. This has created active conflicts with neighboring countries because for China, these aren't just lines on a map. China has been pumping sand onto tiny reefs to create islands where there were none. Then, they build a military outpost on these newly created islands. In the last decade, they've built dozens of these outposts throughout the South China Sea. And you can see that these militarized islands are right inside the waters that the world has agreed belong to these other countries. The Chinese Navy also steps in, patrolling these waters and routinely harassing fishermen from other countries, reminding them that China isn't subject to the rules. This is their water, just like their official map says.
The United States is accusing China of harassment.
A Filipino fisherman was chased by Chinese Coast Guard speedboats as he made a dash for the shallow waters of Scarborough Shoal last Friday.
A similar dispute is happening on a group of islands a little north of here, where Japan, China, and Taiwan all claim these islands that are surrounded by oil and gas fields. China will often flex on Japan by sending Coast Guard ships into the water and airspace around these islands. This is their neighborhood, they think these islands are theirs, and they're going to assert that claim, on the map as well as in real life. On China's map, Taiwan is included as a part of China. Even though Taiwan has been independent for decades, China insists that this is theirs. And if push comes to shove, they've made it very clear that they are willing to claim it back by force. And to that end, this new map includes an addition to the 9-dash line, a 10th dash, a line that drifts dangerously north to encircle the water east of Taiwan. This isn't the first time that a 10th dash has appeared on a Chinese government map, but it is a meaningful moment for the government to just slip in another dash. And it's created a big debate about what this actually means. But one thing that almost all experts agree on is that China's ability to just switch up their ocean claim by adding another dash communicates the original message of using a hand-drawn line as your maritime claim, which is that China feels historically entitled to this region, to this ocean, and they will behave how they choose in their own neighborhood. Especially at a time when its neighbors are partnering with its geopolitical rival, the United States, to surround and encircle China with a large military buildup in the region. The last one I'll mention is a tiny one that's kind of surprising. It's up here where the map claims this river island that should belong to Russia. There was a dispute about this, but 20 years ago, Russia and China agreed to redraw the border like this, giving half of this island back to Russia. But in this map, they claim it once again, and no one is totally sure why. So this new map out of China is a series of political statements, which arguably every map is. Some of these are worthy of debate, some are wishful thinking, and some are downright aggressive. But one thing is clear, China is now rich and powerful, and motivated to exert its geopolitical vision in the world. It's a reminder that maps have always been a tool for great powers to express their aspirations. And this map, in this modern day, is no different.
Okay, next up is Does History Progress by Then and Now. I have liked and subbed to your channel.
In December of 1940, a 43-year-old policeman in London scratched his face on a rose bush. The small wound quickly turned septic, his face ballooned with abscesses and pus, one eye became infected and had to be removed, and the infection spread to his arm and lungs. He was in a huge amount of pain. An escalation like this seems like extreme bad luck to us today, but before antibiotics, life-threatening infection was so common that life expectancy was just 47 years old.
The policeman's doctor decided to try a brand new drug, penicillin. He was the first person in the world to receive it. Around 10 years earlier, Alexander Fleming had returned to his lab from holiday and found that one of his petri dishes was contaminated with mould. He noticed though that the mould had inhibited the growth of the bacteria in the dish, so he took the mould and added it to other dishes, finding the same.
After 4 days of treatment, the policeman was making what his doctor described as a striking recovery. Temperature returned to normal and he was eating well. On the 5th day though, the supply ran out, and a month later he died.
It's been estimated that since, penicillin has saved the lives of maybe 200 million people and saved countless others from excruciating pain. It's probably the most important life-saving discovery in human history. But it also points to a paradox in thinking about progress in history. Not only was it discovered by accident, the mould had floated up through a window accidentally left open onto a petri dish left accidentally out on a bench rather than in an incubator, while the exceptionally cool weather for that time of year had encouraged its growth.
If the discovery of such a life-saving drug is the result of chance, how can we think about progress at all? What drives it? Is it guaranteed, or is it a myth?
Of course, it wasn't just chance. Fleming was a practicing scientist embedded in a context of institutions, aims, methods in a particular culture, and so on. And compare this story to what was going on at precisely the same time, only a few hundred miles away in Germany and Poland. Millions were being systematically murdered, while the innovations of science and technology were being put to good use by Europeans slaughtering each other on battlefields.
How do we make sense of this paradox, that the most important innovation in history, and other medical and scientific advances, were happening at the same time as the most devastating catastrophe in history?
The historian Will Durant wrote that civilization is a stream with banks. The stream is sometimes filled with blood from people killing, stealing, shouting, and doing the things that historians usually record, while on the banks, unnoticed, people build homes, make love, raise children, sing songs, write poetry, and even whittle statues. The story of civilization is the story of what happened on the banks. Historians are pessimists because they ignore the banks for the river.
Is Durant right? Do we all ignore the good in history? Are we all pessimists? How do we even begin to understand the good in history? How it unfolds, what drives it, what could promote it, what we could learn from it? There are countless difficulties here. The first is, what does good even mean? What's the measure? What's the criteria?
Some say health, others happiness, others wealth, stability, community, equality. A postmodern critic that it's impossible to rank these values, to compare and classify, or to place any hope in a grand narrative. What's a long life if it's lived under tyranny? What's a wealthy life if those around you live in poverty?
However, If we were to begin with a loose meta-criterion that I think most would agree on, while nevertheless disagreeing on precisely what it means, we'd land on something like liberty.
Liberty, broadly speaking, is the freedom to think, to speak, to do, to act, to be oneself, to go where one chooses, to strive in the way one wants to strive, to have as many as the primary goods of life as possible in order to do so: food, shelter, transport, even things like good relationships, friendships, opportunities, and so on. Most, I think, would agree that generally more of these things is better than less.
Broad liberty, in this sense, is neutral between competing ideological beliefs or political systems. It begins from a simple premise that more possibility is better than less. The society that has better access to penicillin is better than the one where you're more likely to be sent to a gas chamber.
The historical question, then, is to understand which historical conditions, institutional, political, cultural, philosophical, lead to an increase in liberty and which diminish it. Which ideas about liberty seem to work? Where did they come from? Who built on them, improved them? What diminished or restricted them? The historical question is to search for the causes of liberty so that they can be identified and built upon today. Hegel argued that history was the unfolding of reason through time. Martin Luther King, who read Hegel, argued that the moral arc of history bends towards justice. Marx, building on Hegel, that economic contradictions resolve through history, leading to a more equal society. And more recently, once again drawing on Hegel, some have claimed that liberal capitalism is the end of history.
All of these claims are in some sense Hegelian, and the philosopher Terry Pinkard has recently argued in a work on Hegel that the end at work in history is the securing of justice as freedom.
Freedom is the relationship between desire, reasoning, acting on your desires, and recognition and authority. In other words, our desires don't exist in a vacuum. We are in constant negotiation with others and their desires, with figures and systems of authority that act upon and direct our own desires, and so on. Freedom is intersubjective. Social consciousness, culture, and institutions arise out of the interplay of all our desires socially.
With this in mind, Pinkard asks, does history make sense? Is there logic in the way the interplay of desires plays out? Is history comprehensible? Or is it contingent, subject to chance, random, messy?
But the totality of that interplay is meant to be directed towards increasing freedom. Hegel was a figure of the Enlightenment. Like Kant before him, he believed in a scientific approach to the world, and that included history. He argued that science was bringing the phenomena of the world around us, in nature, in humans, in everything, under what he called the concept. What he meant by this was that we have ideas of things, we have ideas of ourselves, our desires, of others, of history. We categorize things, we look at the qualities of things, the causes of things. The historian looks at the causes of World War II, for example, and builds up an idea of World War II.
Importantly, it's this ability to go about the messy work of building up ideas that makes us human and provides the possibility of even having a history in the first place.
A mouse has a past, but it has no real history. We have ideas of how we acted, why we acted, what we've changed since, for example. A mouse might have a drive to eat which it acts on, but a human has a concept of eating, under which reasons for eating, what to eat, when to eat, what's healthy, how to farm, where to shop, are categorized under the idea or concept of eating. What Hegel is trying to show is how we make sense of the world. That from our ideas and concepts we make judgments about how to act. Once we understand this, we can understand that the idea of salad, say, is a historical one. We've brought more understanding under the concept of salad. How it looks, its chemical composition, its effects, best ways to distribute it and eat it so it's most flavoursome and so on. Humans develop conceptions over time. At times, ideas fall apart and are discarded, and at other times they develop and are adopted. The biblical idea that the sun went around the earth fell apart as it was observed that the opposite was true, so the idea that the Bible was the guide to wisdom was slowly superseded by an emphasis on observation and empiricism. Pinkard writes that the components of the idea arise in history, but as humans reflect on those concepts, put them to use, and modify them in the course of their collective lives, they refashion them into overall schemes of intelligibility.
Hegel was expanding on Spinoza's point that modern scientific and rational inquiry expands outwards towards what he called the perspective of infinity, by looking at the causes and the qualities of the things that help us expand upon our desires and interests.
Pinkard writes that Hegel concludes that freedom is the capacity to make what truly matters effective in one's life, and in modern times that more or less comes down to acting on our reasons rather than on vague feelings or guidance from nature, the gods, or those who claim to rule us by natural right. But again, this is obviously not just an individual process. Our own ideas and desires come into conflict with others. There are agreements and disagreements that play out in culture, in institutions, in norms and practices, in political decisions, etc. But the point is that over time, we tend to try and work up ideas of things that work and ideas of things that don't. Pinkard writes that history is an arena in which people seek and have sought reconciliation. That is a kind of justification for their lives. When it comes to the meta-criterion of liberty, denouncing fascism is thought of as the same as trying to eat more salad. An individual, directed by education, cultural context, social information, makes a judgment that the former had the effect of reducing liberty in the past, and the latter has the effect of increasing energy and lifespan. Hegel says that we emerge from a realm of shadows and move towards the light of the space of reasons.
If this is true, then we should be able to establish some points of historical progress. Which shapes of consciousness, to use Hegel's term, which ideas, practices, institutions in history have promoted liberty?
For Hegel, the process developed as history unfolded, from one being free, a king or an emperor, free to make their own decisions about society, while the others had to follow, to many being free, i.e. an aristocracy, to all, in principle at least, being free. Hegel argued that pre-Greek societies were paternalistic and authoritarian, that they were rule followers, and that they didn't interrogate the reasons for following or abandoning certain rules, and that the Persians, Egyptians, Indians and Chinese civilizations that preceded the Greeks didn't approach the world and people as ideas to be studied, but instead were absorbed in the world around them. They didn't have any reflective critical distance. Without these mechanisms for self-criticism, there can be no movement in history.
it's important to note his interpretation of ancient history has been criticised a lot since, but for our purposes, the important point is less where it started, but the idea of a reflective distance on the world being important, the questioning of why some ideas or rules are adopted and why others are discarded. The Greeks, he thinks, were self-conscious. They had a particularly acute idea of the self and asked questions about it.
It's under these conditions that the question can be more forcefully asked. Who are the people? What does freedom mean? Who rules? And so on. Pinkard writes, the Greek miracle, as it were, was its creation of the polis, a new form of social and political organisation in history in which the ability to defend the community united with an ancient conception of justice into a new kind of unity that broke with the past and thereby combined the advantages of the emotional closeness and solidarity of traditional tribal life with the reflective and economic advantages of an urban life. That these circumstances were crucial for the developing of an idea of freedom. For the Greeks, what made someone free was self-sufficiency, that they weren't under the sway of others, that they had the means to make decisions and live by their own means, own desires, that, in Aristotle's phrase, a person was a law unto himself. Aristotle continued that it's the mark of a free man not to live at another's beck and call. Freedom meant not being compelled. It meant being self-directing, and crucially, it meant not being a slave. But, of course, women and slaves were excluded. The community had ultimate authority over the individual, and the Greek polis in its face-to-face direct democracy struggled to grow. As Benjamin Constant wrote on the problems of the ancient idea of liberty, if this is what the ancients called liberty, they admitted as compatible with this collective freedom the complete subjection of the individual to the authority of the community. In some ways, Rome expanded on the Greek idea of liberty and managed to grow by granting citizenship to many of the areas it conquered. But eventually, of course, ruling was left to the aristocracy, the Senate, and the emperor. But Pinkard writes that once the Greeks had put freedom on the map as a way of thinking about justice, there was a push towards justice as equality and as the mutual recognition of the freedom of all, an actualization of the idea of each being his or her own person. We acknowledge that political liberty, the right to contribute to and to be part of the political process, to have rights, is an important part of liberty, then it must be true to say that the so-called Dark Ages, between the collapse of the Roman Empire in the 5th century to the Renaissance in the 15th, are a regression. Broadly speaking, historians no longer use the term the Dark Ages, using the Middle Ages instead, with many pointing to achievements in architecture and agriculture and mining and much more. Nevertheless, monarchism, absolutism, even the Catholicism of the period don't fit well under our broad idea of what liberty means.
In forms of organisation like monarchy or the medieval church, the right to act, move and worship freely, to contribute towards the decisions that affect your life, quite clearly restricted in important ways. Social positions are carefully orchestrated from above. Different rights, powers and privileges are distributed depending on one's standing and social position from above. Economic activity, religious freedom, education, and so on is, or at least can always in principle be, commanded from above.
We should look briefly then at 4 interrelated moments: the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, and the Enlightenment. When Constantinople was taken by the Ottoman Empire in 1453, an influx of migrants into Europe fleeing led to the discovery of many ancient Greek and Roman texts on everything from music and art to politics and philosophy. The resulting Renaissance, impossible without a printing press invented in 1463, led to a flourishing of commentary on old ideas and new ideas being produced across the continent. It was essentially an explosion of ideas. The discovery of America by Europeans in 1492 also revolutionized attitudes of many across the continent. It showed that the world was much bigger than previously assumed, that there were more people, more ideas and possibilities than had long been assumed. It also proved the usefulness of technology, the commerce and shipbuilding in particular. The Reformation would not have been the same without the Renaissance. The German priest Martin Luther's rejection of the post-supreme authority set off the Reformation across Europe in 1517, encouraging Christians to read the Bible themselves, despite the Church forbidding it. No single person or group should have a monopoly on interpreting God's will, the New Protestant charges. Protestantism was important because it began to democratize the interpretation of morals, ethics and spirituality. Similarly, the Treaty of Westphalia, signed after the fighting between Catholics and Protestants during the 30 Years' War, contained the seeds of the modern idea of the sovereignty of nations, that each nation has the right to determine its own laws, its own course of action, that each, to go back to Aristotle's phrase, was a law unto himself. The scientific revolution was happening at around the same time, and by 1700 the world looked very, very different to how it did in 1400. Copernicus's discovery that the Earth revolved around the Sun rather than the other way round expanded the universe in people's minds in the same way that the discovery of America expanded the Earth in Europeans' mind. Copernicus made the Earth just another celestial body, and this naturally refuted biblical texts and legitimized the further study of the physical universe and the laws of motion and matter. Galileo and Newton revolutionized and formalized the laws of motion and physics, and many began proving that these principles could be applied to innovation through projects like canal building and better architecture and road improvement and navigational instruments. Francis Bacon argued that an inductive method should be used in science, the careful observation of the world. All of this led to an interest in and the improvement of instruments like the barometer, the telescope, the microscope, the compass, cartography, medical instruments, the steam engine, electricity, and modern engineering and science more broadly leading to today. Paul Hazard says that the focus on reason was central, although many dispute this, and he writes that the Enlightenment's essence was to examine, and its first charge was to take on the mysterious, the unexplained, the obscure, in order to project its light out into the world. The world was full of errors, created by the deceitful powers of the soul, vouchsafed by authority beyond control, spread by preference for credulity and laziness, accumulated and strengthened through the force of time. The point is that the Enlightenment aimed to uncover, to shine a light on, to broaden out our understanding of ourselves and the universe, although, as we saw in the last video, it had a dark side too. But Pinkard says that the major turning point in world history has to do with the advantages gained by modern Europeans who have come to comprehend the eternal justice of their world as consisting in a kind of commitment to the equal freedom of all. The Enlightenment, according to many, may have been contradictory, inadequate, misguided. The idea of equal freedom for all conveniently not being applied to colonies, slaves, women, the proletariat. But the question is, despite it taking a painfully slow amount of time, Was it the nascent animating principles of freedom, justice, equality, etc. that slowly unfolded, complexified, became more forceful, more convincing, more nuanced, from the ancient Greeks through to Christianity and the Reformation and the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, and on to things like Marxism, anarchism, decolonization, human rights, and debates about freedom and justice today? Is there a through line? Is it ideas that matter? Is it economics? Is it innovation? Or is it something else?
I think it's worth pausing here to reflect on a problem that this is a common Eurocentric story, and as we discussed in the dark side of history, the expansion of liberties for some has led often to the domination and the reduction of liberties for others.
I'm not suggesting a simple triumphalist narrative, and there is much to include that traditionally isn't. The Islamic Golden Age, the prosperity of the Mughal Empire before the East India Company moved in, science leading to pollution as much as new tools, just to name three.
Furthermore, it's much easier to measure something as distinct as death or violence than it is to measure liberty. What someone sees as liberty varies so much across the world as we move into the modern era. Everywhere, the different methods, technologies, political solutions, languages we have developed for choosing freely to do things has expanded exponentially. So let's return to our initial question briefly. What is liberty?
The philosopher Thomas Hobbes described some places as having more or less liberty. Friedrich Hayek said that the poor in a competitive society are much more free than a person commanding much greater material comfort in a different type of society. John Somerville said that during the Cold War, in a communist world, there was much more freedom from the power of private money and periodic unemployment.
A brief look at the history of the concept shows the difficulty in even agreeing what liberty means, whether it can be measured like height or weight, say.
In his book, A Measure of Freedom, philosopher Ian Carter writes that freedom is the absence of preventing conditions on agents' possible actions. Those preventing conditions can be many. We might be physically prevented, coerced or threatened, unable because of a lack of education or resources, or being born in the wrong place. But a broad point for me is that a measure of freedom is the availability of choice. You might not be free to climb a mountain if you are incapable, but a better society, I'd argue, is the one that, if that is your choice, out of many, many choices, you'll have easier access to the resources and education and time and energy to do so. The same measure can be applied to jobs, health, innovation, cooking, art, religion, travel, politics. A good measure of freedom is one that should be applicable to anything. A society then that has broad access to scientific research is an improvement on one that doesn't. One that has the widest availability of food ingredients is an improvement on the one that doesn't. The easiest access to healthcare. We could go on.
Moving into the 19th century, the new scientific, Enlightenment, liberal, rights-based order was becoming dominant throughout Europe, but especially towards the end of the century, contradictions began to appear. Was it really capitalism as a system that was responsible for progress of any kind? Could capitalism be made ethical? Could rational state organisation better direct the innovations of science and industry? Could empires be overthrown?
The problem, then and now, is the difficulty in agreeing on the causes of liberty. If we say science, or at least some of it, medicine, tools, architecture, has been fundamental in improving the lives of the most people, then the focus should be to discover, protect, and emphasize the conditions that lead to the rise and proliferation of science, to oversimplify. But it's not too much of an oversimplification. You can look to history to see the causes of the scientific revolution, the causes of medical revolutions, to which countries have the best healthcare outcomes. Historians of the scientific revolution, for example, emphasize the activity of academies outside of mainstream universities, on collaboration, on the emphasis on empiricism, on the scientific method, on developing new ways of reporting experiments so that a reader far away could witness the experiment, the start of peer review, the printing press, the cross-dissemination of information. I'm using a broad example, but making a historical point. We use history. We know these things worked in the past, and we further them into the future, through public discourse, in the classroom, in the lab. Another example of this problem comes from the study of the decline of violence. It's mostly agreed now that there was a decline in homicide and violent crime from the end of the Middle Ages through, roughly speaking, to today, with quite a few blips in between. Some, like historian Peter Spurenberg, argue that the cause was the monopolization of state power. As monarchs across Europe became more secure and consolidated their authority, the royal court became a politer and more civilized place, as lords had to jostle for favour, and the monarch was able to capitalize on their power by being more intolerant of volatility. Others have pointed to the rise of commerce and the need for more civil interaction between people to make one's way in life. But on the other hand, the historian Mark Mazower has argued that this state monopolization of power led to the death toll of the 2 world wars and the Holocaust and the nuclear bombs in the 20th century, contradicting this story of civil progress. The point, again, is that the causes of any type of progress are always difficult to identify. Just because a monarch imposed order where elite violence would have previously gone unpunished, say, that doesn't necessarily mean the premise absolute monarchy causes less violence is universally true, like a physical statement or a mathematic formula, and so we should support absolute monarchy forever. This is a laughable error in attribution.
Steven Pinker, who relies heavily on these sorts of arguments in his Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined, falls into this trap.
Historian Gregory Hanton notes that while Pinker is correct to, quote, underline the vertiginous drop in violence since the end of the Middle Ages, he's also prone to wild exaggeration, hyperbole, junk statistics, and reference to fiction as if it were fact, and that he has exaggerated, often outrageously, the contrast between then and now. And take a look at this particularly damning critique in the introduction to a special issue of History and Theory looking at Pinker's work. The overall verdict is that Pinker's thesis, for all the stimulus it may have given to discussions around violence, is seriously, if not fatally, flawed. The problems that come up time and time again are the failure to genuinely engage with historical methodologies, the
Hi guys. Okay, so that's my day. I had a long day. Went to a party today and like, you know, had a really good day and then I came and I worked nine hours today. So, you know, been a long day. So I'm gonna sign out now, go to bed, and get up in the morning and do it all over again. I'll be on tomorrow to play some more games and stuff. Just make sure what look here. Come to skycat.live and click on the cat's face to donate, please. Or please sub on my YouTube channel. Or don't leave a comment, but you know, please sub my YouTube channel. And thank you so much for your time. I love you guys. Goodbye.